Councillor Van Leeuwen. Oh, I don't see him yet. Okay. Councillor McElwain.
Here.
Councillor Kittredge.
Present.
Councillor Dunsmore.
Present.
And Councillor McCrae.
Here.
Okay, we'll keep an eye out for Councillor Van Leeuwen. Ask members of council if there's any disclosure of pecuniary interests under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act with this first meeting. Okay, seeing none. I have a recommendation, no presentations, announcements. I have a recommendation that the Council of the Township of Center Wython confirm the agenda for the Special Committee of the Whole meeting held November 30th, 2020. Mover for that recommendation? Councillor McCrae, second by Councillor McElwain. All in favor? And that is carried. Moving on to consideration of reports. We have one item on this agenda today, and it's a cultural heritage landscape study. It's a project update and then a release of the draft report. And at this point, I will turn it over to Mariana, our senior planner. Welcome, Mariana.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor Linton, members of council. Consultants are with us today, and staff, and good afternoon to members of the public as well that are watching. So, with recent development pressures in the township, particularly in our urban centers and our historic cores, we've identified the need to study and protect not just individual heritage buildings, which has typically been the main focus in the past for heritage efforts, but larger and more comprehensive areas that are unique and valuable to the township, to the community, and that tell the story of its history and its character. So these areas are now known as cultural heritage landscapes, relatively new concept, but the provincial policy framework is now increasingly requiring that we look at ways of identifying and conserving cultural heritage landscapes, which we'll call CHLs just for ease. It's a little easier to say. So while provincial policies do require that growth is focused on existing built-up areas, they also require us to protect our natural and our cultural heritage resources that are considered valuable or significant to our community. And this, of course, involves, as a first step, identification and an inventory of these resources. So in 2019, in the spring last year, which seems like a long time ago now, the township did start a study to identify the most significant CHLs in our community. And we retained ASI Heritage as our consultants, as the primary project consultant, in collaboration with FOTEN Planning and Design and the Land Plan Studio Incorporated. The study involved a great deal of community engagement, which we are very lucky to have, and input throughout the process, including input from local Indigenous communities as well. The entire project has culminated in a draft report, which we are pleased to present today to council and the public. The report is being released for review and comment at this point. And it is a very extensive report, so we want to allow sufficient time and opportunity for the review and feedback. After all the comments are received, the report, another report will go forward to council. So we are asking for comments by the end of January, so 2 months, which should allow sufficient time to review. And once all the comments are received, staff will report back to council seeking endorsement of the list of CHLs that's been prepared, and will provide some recommendations for moving forward with this information that we've received in terms of what we can do with it. So I'm now pleased to introduce Annie Veilleux, project lead, and Kristina Martens, technical lead. They're both from ASI Heritage, and they've done an extensive amount of work on this project with their team. So I do want to thank them for taking us through this extensive process, and they will go through how we arrived at the final list of CHLs. And I do encourage everybody to read the report if they are able to. It is what I think is kind of the first of its kind that brings together very extensive information about the development of the township from its very earliest days. So it is an interesting, although lengthy read, but I do encourage people to read it if they can. So I will now turn it over to Annie and Kristina to take us through the report, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks,
Great.
Maria. Welcome, Annie. Welcome, Kristina.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariana. Mr. Mayor, members of council, it is a pleasure to be here to present the Cultural Heritage Landscape Study. My name is Veilleux from ASI, and I'm here today with my colleague, Kristina Martens. I'll be giving the presentation, but Kristina will be here to assist in answering any technical questions later on if you have any. ASI undertook this study in collaboration with Landplan Studio Inc. and Foten Consultants Inc. This presentation will provide an overview of the project purpose and scope, the study methodology and process, a summary of the 18 significant CHLs that were identified as part of this study, and provide an overview of next steps and recommendations. Next slide, please. Is there
Can we get the slide presentation up?
Can you just share your screen?
Yeah, certainly.
Sure. Thank you, Kristina.
Yeah.
Minor
While
hiccup.
I bring it up. Okay.
Perfect, thank you. Sorry about this. So this study identifies, evaluates, inventories, and maps significant CHLs located in the Township of Centre Wellington. While the inventory itself does not protect CHLs or their component cultural heritage resources or attributes, the study does provide recommendations on priorities for further study. An important part of the study was public engagement to help identify which landscapes within the township are valued. Next slide, please. So what is a cultural heritage landscape, or as Mariana pointed out, a CHL, which it's much easier to say. The provincial policy statement defines a CHL as a defined geographical area that may have been modified by human activity and is identified as having cultural heritage value or interest by a community, including an Indigenous community. CHLs generally fall within 3 categories developed by UNESCO. They can be intentionally designed, like a garden or park often associated with religious buildings or large estates. CHLs can also organically evolve over time by association with and in response to the natural environment. Then we have associative landscapes, which are more about the powerful cultural, artistic, or spiritual associations of the natural environment. Next slide. The key thing to remember about CHLs is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So as the PPS indicates, a CHL involves groupings of individual heritage features such as buildings, structures, spaces, can be views, archaeological sites, or natural elements that are valued together for their interrelationship, their meaning, or association. The 2020 PPS also indicates that CHLs may be properties that have been determined to have cultural heritage value or interest under the Ontario Heritage Act, or have been included on a federal or international register, or are protected through official plan, zoning bylaw, or other land use planning mechanisms. CHLs can vary in scale, in spatial pattern, and can sometimes overlap. Next slide, please. So why do we identify and manage CHLs? Well, these special spaces, corridors, sites, areas, they're all hallmarks of a municipality. They contribute to the character of a community. They help tell the story of a community and can enrich its identity. They are places for tourism, environmental stewardship, recreation, and community collaboration. These are very special places. Next slide, please. The study was undertaken in 3 phases, at the end of which was a point of contact and engagement with the public. This included an open house and community workshops in the fall of 2019 at the end of phase 1, and an open house in January 2020 at the end of phase 2. And as Mariana indicated, we're now at the end of phase 3, and the public has the opportunity to provide feedback on our draft final report. Next slide, please. So in this next part of the presentation, I'd like to briefly take you through our methodology from information gathering, analysis to results. It's important to note, however, that the identification and evaluation of CHLs is not such a linear process. There's definitely an iterative process based on research, fieldwork, public engagement, and then back again. Next slide, please. So the first step is information gathering to support the identification, documentation, and evaluation of candidate CHLs. Next slide. We consulted federal, provincial, and municipal databases to understand specific properties or areas previously identified by the township or other jurisdictions as potential candidate cultural heritage landscapes, or their potential contribution to potential CHLs. Next slide. Research was conducted to identify overarching historical themes, key periods of development, and significant people that have shaped the development of the township and the evolution of its CHLs. We reviewed historical mapping and aerial photographs, primary and secondary source materials, and we delved into the physiography and natural environment of the township. Next slide. Our research enabled us to get a better understanding of the local factors, both natural and cultural, that have influenced the formation of CHLs in the township. Cultural heritage is inextricably linked to natural heritage. So natural elements such as physiographic features and the Grand River watershed influenced how people interacted with the land for thousands of years. They influenced where and how people traveled, where and how people settled, and where and how people farmed or developed industries, helping shape the CHLs that we see today. Next slide. The township of Centre Wellington is an incredibly scenic area. I'm sure I don't have to sell you on that. The township is characterized by physiographic features that are the foundation of the landscape we see today, including a combination of low hills, hummocky areas, and flatter, gently rolling plains accented by rivers and creeks. These features played a significant role in the indigenous land use and pioneer settlement of the area, providing both opportunities and obstacles. Next slide. The Grand River, which forms the backbone and the heart of the township, influenced the movement of people through the landscape, as well as their interaction with the landscape. There's a number of water and land-based transportation routes used by Indigenous people and later on by early settlers that were shaped and formed by the Grand River and its watershed. The Grand River played a key role in defining treaty boundaries, such as the Haldeman Tract, and ultimately the Grand River has shaped how and where many of the CHLs in the township were formed. Next slide. Another major influence on the landscape was the early 19th century imposition of a grid structure of lots and concessions laid out by surveyors. Settlement within the township really kicked off in the early 1820s, with villages established to take advantage of the rich waterways, including Pierpoint, Fergus, Elora, Salem, and Aboyne. The village of Bellwood and other hamlets formed throughout the mid to late 19th century, many of which supported families living and working the agricultural lands. Next slide. Industries like agriculture, mills, and other early water-powered industries, manufacturing, quarrying, the introduction of the railways, construction of the Shan Dam, as well as the tourism and art industries have all helped shape land use, as well as people's perception of the land in which they live, work, and play. Next slide, please. Another key aspect of information gathering is fieldwork. The consultant team undertook fieldwork on a number of occasions throughout the project to get an understanding of the overall township and to identify, document, and evaluate candidate CHLs. And we collected a number of information and data and photos as part of our field review. Next slide, please. The public engagement strategy for the study was comprised of a series of engagement tools and sessions designed to introduce, inform, and solicit public input in a meaningful manner. Connect CW, which hosted the online engagement, was launched in July 2019 and provided study information and updates, a mapping tool for people to identify places of interest, and 2 separate surveys. The website also posted our presentations and boards that we prepared for public meetings. Public open house number 1 was held in September and was quickly followed by the mapping sessions. The goal of these sessions was to inform the public about the study and gather input on potential candidate CHLs that are important to the community. Next slide. The 2 mapping sessions in October were very well attended. The participants were asked to take part in 2 mapping exercises. They were asked to create individual mental maps of their community and then work in groups to identify areas, corridors, and individual sites of value. Each group then had a chance to present their maps. And I have to say that these mapping workshops were one of the highlights of the study for me personally. There was such enthusiasm and knowledge exchange and people connecting. It was really great to be part of it. Next slide, please. At the end of phase 2, we had our second open house and we shared the list of candidate CHLs that we were recommending move forward with the evaluation. So we presented that to get feedback, to make sure that A, we hadn't missed a landscape from the public's perspective, but also B, to run through our initial thoughts on potential boundaries and attributes. As I mentioned earlier, the identification and evaluation of candidate CHLs is quite iterative and requires this back and forth. So following the feedback received at this open house and following the open house, the proposed boundaries for the Elora Historical Village Core and the Fergus Historical Village Core were expanded beyond the commercial cores to include the surrounding residential and industrial areas, which better reflected what is necessary as part of a historical village core. The Indigenous engagement program for the study followed the approach of separate and direct engagement with rights-bearing Indigenous communities and organizations. 6 communities or organizations were contacted, and project notices and updates were circulated throughout the project, and a draft report was circulated in the fall for review and comment. At various points in the project, we received feedback from the Huron-Wendat Nation, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the 6 nations of the Grand River Elected Council. Next slide, please. So after all this information gathering, our next step was the analysis. Next slide. So to be identified as a candidate CHL, an area had to kind of check 3 things. It had to correspond to the historical themes and associations important to the development of the township. It had to contain a grouping of cultural heritage resource identified through visual survey, and it had to be a landscape valued by a community. So the identification of candidate CHLs was informed by a few things. It was informed by a preliminary list of 17 candidate CHLs that was provided by the township in collaboration with the Heritage Committee. It was informed by our project team meetings with the township, by the online mapping tool and our online survey number 1, as well as the open house and our mapping sessions. It was also informed by Indigenous engagement, our historical research, and field survey. Next slide, please. So given the rich history and intact heritage of Central Wellington and the high level of public input, it was necessary to prioritize the candidate CHLs for evaluation as part of this study. So while individual properties, including agricultural properties, can be considered CHLs, for the purposes of this study, priority was given to larger geographical areas or areas containing multiple properties that are known to be valued by multiple community sources. An exception was given to a few individual public properties of significant design, historical, or contextual value. So individual features and properties identified by stakeholders in the public were incorporated as part of larger candidate CHLs as appropriate. Our report lists all the candidate CHLs that were considered, as well as recommendations for prioritization for the evaluation phase. So future studies may consider these candidate CHLs that were not evaluated as part of the study. Next slide, please. So once we had our priority list of candidate CHLs, more CHL-specific research was undertaken. Reviewing, again, mapping, aerial photographs, primary, secondary sources. We consulted with archivists and librarians, community members and historians, and also a lot more further field review. Next slide. So then we get to our evaluation methodology. We used a 3-pronged approach to evaluate the candidate CHLs. So a candidate CHL that has been evaluated and found to have 1, cultural heritage value or interest, 2, community value, and 3, historical integrity is considered to be a significant CHL. It had to meet all 3 categories. The candidate CHLs were also evaluated against the UNESCO categories to ensure that they appropriately demonstrated a high degree of significance. In addition to the information gathered as part of the first 2 phases of the project, the evaluation of the candidate CHLs was further informed by communication with the township, our online survey number 2, our open house number 2, as well as additional historical research and field survey. Next slide, please. And now we get to our results. Next slide. So 18 significant CHLs were identified as part of this study. Inventory sheets were created for each CHL, which forms the last volume 3 of our report, which include a description of place, a summary of findings related to cultural heritage value or interest, historical integrity, and community value, and also presents a preliminary list of heritage attributes and preliminary boundaries of the CHL. So the 18 significant CHLs include the Grand River Corridor, the Elora Cataract Trailways, Salem, the Elora Municipal and St. Mary Cemeteries, Elora Gorge, Victoria Park and Victoria Crescent Neighborhood in Elora, the Elora Historical Village Core, the Elora Quarry, the Trestle Bridge Trail, the Allen Farmstead, Beatty Brothers Factory and Residential Area, the Fergus Historical Village Core, the Churchill Crescent Neighborhood, Farrier Estate and Union Street East, Bellside Cemetery, Victoria Park and Fergus, Bellwood Historical Village Core, and Ustick, an agricultural landscape. So next slide, please. So the significant CHLs are spread out across the township, but are concentrated along the Grand River Corridor, which isn't too surprising. We did identify one key agricultural landscape. Given the number of intact historical agricultural properties throughout the township, it was difficult to draw a preliminary boundary around any one area. So through the course of the study, we developed a more detailed identification methodology for agricultural areas that could be applied to other areas of the township in the future. Next slide. So these are the significant CHLs in and around Elora and Fergus. And I want to point out again that these boundaries are preliminary and were identified based on the information gathered as part of this study. The preliminary boundaries may be refined upon closer inspection in future phases of study, and any future phases of study will include additional public engagement. All right, next slide, please. So the identification and evaluation of CHLs is the first stage in the conservation process. Following identification of significant CHLs, technical studies or other initiatives may be conducted to provide a more detailed assessment. The goal of that assessment would be to ensure a comprehensive understanding of the heritage values and attributes, to verify or refine boundaries, and consult specifically on that particular place with the public, stakeholders, and Indigenous communities. CHL-specific technical studies can also be used to develop conservation measures for the protection of the CHL, whether through the Ontario Heritage Act or through tools enabled by the Planning Act. Next slide, please. The significant CHLs may be prioritized for technical study. So prioritization considers the threats to and opportunities for the CHLs, and it can include such factors as the needs of the township, the owners and the users, community interest, potential for environmental impacts, or available resources. Areas where there is a high risk of development within and adjacent to the CHL, a high risk of alteration of heritage attributes, or opportunities for economic and tourism benefits can be priorities for technical studies. Our report recommends that CHLs within the urban areas should be prioritized for technical studies, including Salem, Victoria Park and Victoria Crescent Neighborhood in Elora, the Elora Historical Village Core, the Beatty Brothers Factory and Residential Areas, the Fergus Historical Village Core, the Churchill Crescent Neighborhood, Farrier Estate and Union Street East, Bellside Cemetery, and Victoria Park and Fergus. Next slide, please. CHLs in rural areas, which tend to be more stable, can occur later. Additionally, properties owned and managed by the Grand River Conservation Area are considered a lower priority given their existing regulatory framework and the need to balance heritage conservation with flood control challenges. Lower priority CHLs for the technical studies include the Grand River Corridor, Elora Cataract Trailway, Elora Municipal and St. Mary Cemeteries, the Elora Gorge, Elora Quarry, the Trestle Bridge Trail, the Allen Farmstead, Bellwood Historical Village Core, and the Ustick Agricultural Area. But threats to and opportunities for CHLs should continue to be monitored and areas prioritized as required. Next slide, please. So the overall recommendation is that the 18 areas be identified as significant CHLs in the Township of Centre Wellington. There was one additional area, Pier Point, that has been identified as requiring further information to appropriately evaluate as a CHL. This study provides the basis for the continued research and understanding of these significant CHLs and for areas that may be evaluated or identified in the future. Centre Wellington's rich history has created a depth of outstanding landscapes and buildings that are well preserved to this day. the inventory of significant CHLs is expected to be added to, reviewed, and evolve over time. The identification and evaluation of CHLs is one step in the conservation process and will continue to be an ongoing planning exercise. Recommendations in our report have been made for the short term, medium term, and long term. So short-term recommendations are that the Township endorse the inventory of cultural heritage landscapes, that the Township collaborate with Wellington County to determine if any of the significant CHLs are regionally significant, that the Township of Centre Wellington staff utilize the information contained in the study to inform the prioritization of technical studies and other initiatives, and that the inventory of cultural heritage landscapes be made publicly available as a means of celebrating the unique identity of the Township to further foster the current culture of conservation and cultural heritage appreciation of these places. Recommendations for the medium and long term relate to the initiation of technical studies towards the ongoing conservation of these places, the ongoing identification of CHLs, and collaboration with the GRCA for the ongoing stewardship of properties and their ownership. Next slide, please. So we are looking forward to receiving comments and feedback on this study. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Kristina. That was a great report and great presentation. I'm really excited that we moved ahead to do this project. I think all of us who have grown up here and know this area so well know all those places that you've identified, and they're special to us, but it's really good that we have a report here that explains why they're so special. So thanks for that. Mariana, did you have anything that you wanted to add before I turn it over to council?
No, not at this point. I think I would just be happy to answer any questions myself or the consultants about any specifics about the study, the methodology, or the final list of sites. As I said, this is only being released now for comment. So we are encouraging input from the public, from council, and we will be bringing forward a final report back to council that incorporates that input and makes any changes as required. And then we will be looking at the recommendations that are made in the report and definitely trying to find a way to move forward with the recommendations.
Great, thank you very much, Mariana. Turning it over for comments and questions of council, starting with Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Mayor. Madame Veilleux, thank you for a very, very good report. I wanted to express my appreciation, Madame Veilleux, that I was so glad to see that our significant heritage areas, and in particular our cultural heritage landscapes, are recognized and will be preserved under this plan. So I'm very glad to see that. Thank you. No questions, Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Foster. Councillor McElwain.
There we go. Yeah, thanks very much for that report. Your report, the overall package that we received today is probably the most complete package I've seen in the number of years I've been on council, and it's very informative. I think it should actually become a part of the school curriculum for local students, to be honest. It really is a great history lesson. I just had one question, and wondering if a CHL provides any protection for different areas. What is the level of protection it provides? And the reason I'm asking this question is because some of our GRCA properties could be threatened with recent changes or suggested changes to the GRCA or Conservation Authority abilities, and I'm just wondering if CHLs would help protect those pieces of property that we all do value so much.
Thank you for your question. So our study was about the identification and putting together an inventory of CHLs. So in and of itself, a cultural heritage landscape is a label, is a type of resource. So following this step, this is just the first step in terms of conservation of these places. So following this study, the township may take on additional technical studies that are CHL specific, and those studies we'd have the opportunity to develop protection measures for these places. Protection measures could be through tools under the Ontario Heritage Act, be it Part 4 or 5 designation. So you can also use tools under the Planning Act. So it could be protected through policies in the official plan, through zoning bylaw or design guidelines. So there's different ways to approach the protection of CHLs. Certain CHLs you can look at and determine all it needs is some commemoration and to share the story, while other CHLs that are perhaps under more threat, you can put in more policies for protection. In terms of the properties under GRCA, in terms of GRCA properties, we recommend that the township work together with GRCA to really understand the threats to, the opportunities to each CHL, and work together to develop protection measures for these places. I don't know if Mariana, you want to add something else in terms from the township's perspective on this?
No, thank you, Annie. That was a very good comprehensive answer. But Annie's correct. It just depends. That'll be our job, sort of moving forward on this, is identifying each one of those and then trying to determine what is the best approach for moving forward on this, based on the level of threat and opportunity. And as the GRCA's mandate, if anything changes in that respect, then we could look at and try to work with the GRCA to see if there are protection measures needed, a little bit, because the GRCA obviously has their regulation and authority that they work under in terms of protecting properties, but also we can work with them to further enhance that through official plan policies, identifying areas and guidelines under the Planning Act, and we can also under the Heritage Act identify areas that could be further protected.
Thanks, Mariana. Councillor Kittrus?
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to thank the presenters and the company for doing an excellent job. I learned a lot. I think that every new resident should actually receive a little package. So I learned. I'm not from here, but I've lived here for 35 years, and I definitely learned a lot of things and from the study. And I think that new residents and new people coming in can have a much greater appreciation for where they're moving through reading this. I do have one question, and it's for Mariana. Since these have identified these cultural landscape areas, number one, is this just limited, or can this grow in areas as each study is done? And also, properties outside of these cultural areas that have been identified, specifically heritage buildings, would they still be protected, like under our regular legislation, to the same extent, or would it be less?
Thank you. Through you. So in terms of whether this areas can grow and change, yes, this is an evolving document. So it's a starting point. So we will be looking at a program of monitoring, and that is something that will be coming forward as well. So how do we monitor? We're going to be setting up sort of a process and adding to or modifying some of the boundaries. And then we'll be looking at, as I said previously, in terms of prioritizing, each one of them will delve into more in terms of further technical studies or further analysis. Some may be simply requiring commemoration and public education, and then others might require much more detailed study for example, heritage districts, if we want to implement protection guidelines. As for our heritage buildings, that is a process that sort of runs concurrently. So while these landscapes might contain a very high concentration of heritage buildings, there are protection tools that are slightly different. So the Heritage Act does provide us the ability to protect our buildings, and we're well versed in that already. Those tools fall under designations. So whether you're designating as an individual property or building, and then or an entire district, those are done under the Ontario Heritage Act. And we still have our municipal register. We can talk about adding these landscapes to our municipal register to publicly showcase them as well. So that would be another step that we're going to be exploring and coming forward to council with. But the register actually gives us that 60-day protection for anything that's not designated already or protected, as you know. So those buildings that are still under threat of demolition, that those will still come to council in terms of the demolition requests when they're listed and have been identified as having some potential heritage value. And those that are already protected, obviously we work with council and with the owners in terms of alterations to those buildings, but we are also still continually trying to increase the number of designated properties that we have. So we do have a subcommittee of our Heritage Committee that continually works on trying to protect individual properties, but this is just another element that looks at those as groupings and the ability to look at those on a comprehensive basis in terms of trying to identify those character areas that contribute to the history of the township and that we really want to protect. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Mariana. Councillor Dunsmore.
I don't have any questions per se. I just wanted to thank Kristina and Annie. I attended your mapping sessions and I attended a public meeting, and I was very impressed at the way you ran those and how much community engagement you got. And that clearly is shown in the final report, and we'll see what kind of feedback we get and what changes we need to make moving forward. But thank you very much.
Councillor McCray.
Thank you, Mayor Linton. I found the report fascinating. I've lived here all my life, and yet I felt I was discovering my community for the first time. The only question I have is, do we have a time frame for when we expect completion of the short-term recommendations and starting into the technical studies? I guess, obviously, I'm eager to get going on that next section.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Linton, I can try to answer that. Staff is planning to bring this forward in the late winter, early spring, in terms of getting the final endorsement for the sites and to make sure that we incorporate any public feedback that we've received. And then we are looking to come to council at that point to ask for an extension of the scope of the study to start working more directly in terms of implementation strategies and tools. So we are very anxious to actually start implementing some of the recommendations. We don't have an exact timeline, but I expect we can bring that forward to council in the very near future once we go through each one of the sites specifically and can determine. There is going to be a level of analysis required to determine what the best approach is for each landscape that's been identified, the best tools, and then what the funding requirements will be and the timelines. So we expect to bring that forward to council as well, because that will help further all of this work.
Brett, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we have the capital account for this project has remaining funds in it. So that the part that Mariana referred to as the extension of work to start working on the prioritization is something that can be accommodated, at least in part, within the dollars that we already have allocated for this project. But if you look at the 10-year capital budget, we've also budgeted placeholder funds starting in 2022 and then every other year thereafter so that the work can continue. And so the early work that we want to engage, hopefully ASI again, will look at the first level of how to prioritize these 17 or 18 different CHLs. And then we'll have to talk about what the strategy is for each one and identify the cost to go along with that.
Thanks, Brett. Well, thanks so much for this presentation. Really, really good job. I'm really excited about us moving ahead and finding ways to communicate this out so we just celebrate our community and the different amazing attributes this community has. Newcomers, people that have been here all their lives, I see so many applications for taking some of this work and communicating it out in really fun ways. So thanks so much for all the work that was put in here. I just wanted to remind Council that you have till January the 29th to get any comments back to the project team. And then we'll be seeing the revisions come to Council after that. So thanks again for all the work that you've done on this and significant community effort that was put into this project. Great job. And with that, that concludes our agenda for this special meeting, and I'll ask for an adjournment of this meeting here. Moved by Councillor McCrae, seconded by Councillor Dunsmore. All in favor? And this meeting is adjourned, and we'll come back to our closed meeting. There's a separate Zoom call in for our Zoom meeting, so make sure you get the right link, and we'll be at our closed meeting at 2 o'clock. Okay? Talk to you soon. Thanks.